Love this podcast? Support it and sponsor today. Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.
Welcome to Hong Kong Confidential. I'm Jules Hannaford and I'm your host. I'm an Australian woman and I've been living in Hong Kong for many years. I'm a mother, a teacher, an author, and I want to share my wisdom and the wisdom of others with you. Thanks for joining me and I hope you enjoy the show. Today I'm here with Valentina Tudose for the second time. Welcome back, Valentina. Thanks for joining me today.
Thank you for having me, Jules. It's exciting to be back.
It's really exciting to be back. And for our listeners out there, Valentina was Happy Ever After, episode 2, if they want to go back and check out the advice from a dating and relationship coach. But Valentina, can you tell me what brings you here to me today?
So last time we spoke, I was talking to you about how I help people be better at dating and relationship. At the beginning of this year, I realized that a lot of the skills that I'm using to help my adult clients navigate relationships, specifically online dating, can be very, very useful for younger people. Because one of the things I've always struggled with is the fact that nobody teaches us how to be in relationships. So we don't get a lot of appropriate information about how to behave in a relationship when we grow up. So we have to learn through trial and error. And I think it's even harder for young people these days because of this technology, because of the way that mobile phones have changed the way we interact with each other. So I was reading an article in the New York Times in January that said there is quite a lot of pressure that teenage girls are under these days to send sexually explicit images and texts to boys they are dating or they're considering dating. And that can actually get them into trouble, not because there's something wrong with that, but they can be misused and, whole lives and reputations can be ruined. So it made me think that this whole issue is actually much bigger than just teenagers not knowing whether it is appropriate or not to send naked pictures of themselves, but it goes much deeper to the fundamental cultural norm that it's okay for boys to pursue girls and to push girls into doing things that maybe they are uncomfortable with. And the girls don't know how to say no.
Is that part of what you want to do, is educate the girls how to say no, but also educate the boys not to pressure girls to do things like that?
It's obviously two sides of the same coins, right? In general, I think in our society, women are not encouraged to enforce our boundaries around anything that we want, and we are not really educated how to say no. I guess the Me Too movement and the Time's Up movement are exactly proof of the fact that we get pushed and cajoled, or whatever words you want to use, into doing things that we don't want. But if there was no requirement, or if there was no pressure from the men and the boys in our lives, no girl would ever send a picture of her boobs to anybody.
Yeah, it wouldn't.
Right?
Yeah,
it just doesn't happen.
No,
it is much more common for women to receive unsolicited images of sexual nature completely out of the blue and without them ever asking. But the opposite is not true. So obviously, I think there needs to be education around respect on the masculine side of the divide, and really understanding what consent is all about, because that's a really big...
Consent is a big issue. So can you talk to me more about consent? What does it mean to give consent, and how important is it?
Well, to me, consent is really like a tennis match. It's not like, because I said I was going to go on a date with you, I agree to you kissing me. Or if I agreed to kiss you, it means that I'm okay with you having sex with me. And even if I've agreed to have sex with you, it doesn't mean that from now on forever you can have sex with me. I literally was just having this conversation with a client an hour ago when we were talking about a relationship she has. And just because you had certain relationships with this person, it doesn't mean that it's just an ongoing thing. It's like, okay, we don't have to discuss this anymore. We go straight into it. So the reason I say it's like a tennis game is because every move, every action that one person takes needs to kind of be checked with the other person to make sure that this is still okay with you. And there's a lot of media buzz around this whole idea of, well, I was giving all these non-verbal signals
yeah.
and he didn't get it. Mm-hmm. Like, yeah, well, if the guy was truly paying attention, yes, the girl maybe could have been a little bit more vocal and stand up and leave the room if she was uncomfortable. But if the boys knew more about respect and understanding the whole idea of consent not being a blank check and being something that you continuously have to reassure yourself that it's happening, we would have a lot less of this situation. So definitely boys need to learn to respect that and to continuously check.
I think it's also interesting to note that even if you're halfway through the act of sex and you change your mind, you can say no. You don't have to continue at any point.
That's what I'm saying. Consent is freely given, but it's also freely retracted because you don't know what you say yes to in the beginning. So it's good to keep checking with each other. So it's the same for this idea of boys asking girls questions and asking girls to share things. And, kids are going to be kids. They're going to do it no matter what we say to them. But it is better if they know how to do it safely.
Or I think also they need to think of the consequences. Teenagers don't often think about the consequences of their actions, and it can mean that it can affect their future, their jobs, their university placements, or their reputation, or even their health and well-being.
Absolutely.
Because if you send a picture of your boobs to your current boyfriend, what happens if you break up and he wants revenge?
Exactly.
Then things can go terribly wrong, can't they?
Yeah. And, in the old days, if you kissed a boy behind the school building, it was just between you and him. And maybe, yes, he would brag to his friends, but that would just slowly get, lost in the drama of high school, right? And you could still have a completely happy life even people knew that you were kissing boys behind the school building. I'm talking about myself here, obviously.
Yeah, I wasn't so lucky.
But
there were no cameras, there were no smartphones, there was nobody documenting it. It wasn't on the internet. There was no internet.
So you could completely reinvent yourself. But now what you may not realize as a 15-year-old is that whatever you put on the internet, even if it's supposed to be private, encrypted conversations between you and a certain person, you have no control over it. And it can pop up at the worst of times when you may be looking for a job, or maybe you're just about to get accepted into your dream university, and people do background checks. And unfortunately, this stuff is there.
And everything that's put on the internet is indelible. It's there forever. Even if you delete it, it's still there on the dark web somewhere.
That's right.
And then there's companies that have people trained to be able to find this stuff. So they've got the skills to go in and find stuff. And they do look. Bosses will look at social media accounts before they hire people.
And although personally, I think whatever you did in high school or whatever you do in your private life should not affect your chances of getting a job. Unfortunately, we do get judged for the entirety of our personality, and something that looks trivial and small and private and like nobody's business can definitely change your life in a negative way.
Absolutely. And we need to understand that the choices that we make now can affect us later on. And that's what young people don't think about, because they really live in the now, don't they?
Exactly.
What's your definition of sexting? What does that mean?
Well, this was a term that was actually invented by an Australian journalist. I don't know if you knew that. I think back in 2005. Know. So it's one of those, what they call a portmanteau. So a combination of two words. Obviously, it's sex and texting. And it obviously means the exchange of sexually explicit or sexual content over mobile phones or computers. And sexting can be in pictures, or it can be words. It can be describing a fantasy to each other. It's just another way of communication. As long as it is happening between two consenting adults, it's whatever you do in your private life. But it has sometimes damaging consequences if it's abused.
Do you think there's a culture that's developing more and more of boys pressuring girls to send nude images?
I suppose it's kind of an old story and the new story in one. Obviously, boys have always been, in general, right? It is the kind of cultural right of men to pursue, to be the ones initiating courtship or romance or love or whatever. So it is kind of the traditional role of the guy to push women out of their comfort zone, to do things that girls in general are taught you shouldn't be doing this. But we also live in a hyper-sexualized society where kids have instant access to pornography on their phones. And no matter how much parental control you put on your devices, I'm pretty sure that this is where people get most of their sex education. There is actually a lot of research on that. So yeah, and there's this biology, there's curiosity, when your hormones are raging and you kind of are wondering what's happening under that girl's top. you kind of want to see that. And in a way, the mobile phones and cameras and all that have made that much easier, or it has facilitated a sort of false sense of privacy, I think, because when you are having a conversation with someone, it is between you and that someone, and you can say, oh, it's completely fine. It's just going to be me for my eyes only and all that. And as you said, in most cases, it's fine. But yeah, a disgruntled boyfriend or someone who's unhappy that you may have moved on can totally be going into this whole revenge mode and deliberately try to hurt you and shame you and embarrass you in front of your friends and families and teachers. And that's when it's really dangerous. And this is what I think girls don't necessarily realize.
And because of social media, it's far-reaching.
Yeah.
You know, once somebody puts something out there, it can go a long way very quickly.
Yeah.
It was interesting the other day, I was reading about the release of oxytocin in the brain. So when you have a sexual connection with somebody, oxytocin is released, and that's called the love hormone. And it actually can make you make irrational decisions and make you really not think sensibly and think about consequences. Can you tell me more about that?
Yeah, I'm fascinated by this, so I'm so glad you bring it up. So technically, oxytocin's function, like biological function in a body, is to create motherly love. So to create that attachment between the mother and the baby, so that, you know, this is mother's nature's way of making sure that we don't abandon our children. But it is also very important in sexual interaction. The only thing that most people do not realize is that the female brain produces a huge amount of oxytocin compared to the male brain.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yes, which is why women get a lot more attached.
Ah, right. That's so interesting. And why women seem to make more stupid mistakes.
Yeah, because this is actually called the bonding hormone.
Right.
Like I said, between mother and child, but also between lovers. So that's why it's much easier for men to have kind of no strings attached sex. They just kind of move from woman to woman and they kind of go, yeah, it was great, fantastic, but it doesn't mean anything. It doesn't mean that suddenly I have to marry you.
Have you heard of the phrase, women have sex to get love and men love to get sex?
Yes.
There you go. That summarizes what you just said.
That's exactly right. So especially in your teenage years, when you're really not quite sure about what's happening, the hormonal response that you have to certain things like that, of course, that makes you want to please your boyfriend, not to mention the whole cultural thing that we're supposed to be pleasing people in our life. You don't want to do something that might upset the guy you're dating because what if he dumps you afterwards? But we could learn to do it differently because the more we please people, the less they care about us.
Oh, that's interesting. Tell me more about that.
Well, it's just the whole idea that men are supposed to be the hunters and they like to chase. And the moment that they no longer have to chase you, they kind of become complacent and they think, well, got that one in the bag. I don't need to do anything.
Right.
So they kind of move on to new targets, so to speak.
So that comes back to the old saying of treat 'em mean, keep 'em keen.
To some extent, there is a certain truth to that. But it's actually more, as you say that, I'm thinking of, there's a book called Why Men Marry Bitches.
Oh, okay.
And it's kind of a nice way of saying that men will always be interested and will pursue women who have a high sense of personal value and self-worth because they will live their lives, like a queen, basically. I do everything to suit me and you can find ways to fit into my life. I'm not going to change my entire life to suit you. But unfortunately, because of lack of self-esteem and because of not feeling very good about ourselves, a lot of women turn into these kind of unrecognizable doormats when they meet someone. And I know so many women, a lot of my adult clients are the most amazing, successful, powerful women at work. And then suddenly they meet a man that they like and they just turn into these kind of mindless puppies following him around. And that's actually a lot of it is due to a combination of oxytocin and low self-esteem.
Right, interesting. And when you're a teenage girl, that's when your self-esteem can sometimes be at its lowest, or you can be your most vulnerable because you're finding your way in the world and you're growing up and you've got all the hormones. So do you think that's part of the reason why teenage girls in particular, get more sucked into doing things that they don't necessarily want to do in regard to sex?
Definitely. I think it's not to say that teenage girls are not interested in sex. It's just that they are much more, I suppose, restricted through the cultural norms that, you have to be a good girl, you have to do things a certain way and don't do that and don't do that. So all these things that we get sort of programmed to believe as we're growing up as girls versus boys do affect the way that we feel about ourselves when we have to define ourselves as sexual beings. Because this is what, for me, the teenage period in our life is that developmental stage where we're trying to define who we are. And if we get positive experiences, if we feel loved and appreciated, if we get the validation that we want from the people around us and from the people we date, we become strong and we believe in ourselves. But if we have maybe less positive experiences and, I don't know, people don't treat us nicely, or we tend to go out with boys who are not so nice and we end up having our heart broken. And the worst part is that we feel bad about ourselves. We feel like we're not good enough. And, it only takes 3 incidents to form a belief. So let's say you go on 3 dates with 3 guys who are nasty to you, or they treat you without respect. And you suddenly think, well, I'm obviously not good enough because these people, they all treat me bad. So it's an interesting way of looking at how we can give young people more, not only information about what relationships are like, which is kind of what I'm trying to do right now, educate them how to enforce boundaries, how to decide who they are, but also give them the tools to handle such situations without blaming themselves and without feeling that it's their fault.
And without shame.
Without the shame, yeah.
Do you feel that the starting point for young people is to build self-esteem and to build their self-respect, and then from there they're able to make better choices?
Yes, I work a lot with this concept of limiting beliefs. You know what that is. It's all this garbage that is put into our head, or the interpretation.
Do you mean like negative self-talk?
Yes.
Okay.
It's a belief, like every single person that I've met, myself included, and I didn't know this until recently, everybody believes that to some level, at some point in our life, we're not good enough. And it can be like, oh, I look stupid when I'm at the gym because I'm not, a supermodel, or like, I'm not good enough because that boy that I like in the 5th grade didn't pay attention to me. And therefore, that's like a conclusion that I make that nobody will ever like me. So there are these stories that we tell ourselves, actually, and they come from the way we perceive and we interpret our reality. And there's always things that are happening in our life as we grow up as children that we can interpret negatively. The fundamental work that I do with my clients is to really help them understand what these beliefs are and how they hold them back. And if you do believe, like I said, if you have experiences at some point in your young childhood or teenage years that teach you that you are not good at relationship, or you're shy, or all girls laugh at you, for example, you're going to grow into an adult that feels uncomfortable with girls, that feels embarrassed around girls. If you've had these experiences, that is your reality. Before you even go and talk to a girl, you're not going to have the guts to go and open up the conversation. So for teenagers, I think it is really very important that they learn that their self-esteem is actually not coming from other people. It's not about what other people are telling you or how other people are making you feel. It's about taking personal responsibility for who you are. And yes, as a teenager, you have no idea. I know people who are in their 50s and they still have no idea who they are and what they want to be. And they're still looking for meaning. But this is exactly why I'm here, because I'm working with too many people in their 30s and 40s who can trace back all the problems that they're having in relationships right now to when they were teenagers and they weren't allowed to date, or they had some bad dating experiences that they didn't know what to make of. And then they started developing these beliefs. They're like, oh, I'm not good at relationships. I'm not good enough. I'm too old. I'm too fat. I'm too skinny. I'm too whatever. All the men or all the boys are taken, or I'm never going to find someone. So there's a huge list of things that we tell ourselves that literally stop us from getting what we want. And I think that if we approach it with the younger generation and we teach them that they can create a new reality for themselves, a reality in which they are fully in control of their life, they will have much more positive relationships. And it's not like I'm working myself out of a job, but I just hope that more people will grow into adults who have better relationship skills.
So you really have been inspired to work with younger people or teenagers so that you don't see so many people that are struggling in their 30s and 40s.
Well, I was inspired because to do this, it was never really my intention to work with young people, because I thought, obviously, the whole dating life is what you have to do. You have to go through this stuff to learn how it works. But when I see how every time I talk to a client who's struggling in a relationship or with dating, and they tell me, oh, this is because when I was in high school, my parents didn't allow me to date. They told me that, oh, you have to focus on your school results. Dating is bad for you. It's distracting. You really need to focus on education first. And I think that in a way that's both hypocritical and also a little bit silly, because especially among the Asian population, this is very common. So parents don't allow girls to date. They say you can only date after university. So that means you're 22, 23 when you're kind of ready.
Starting out,
but you have no experience. You've never been on a date. Sometimes you've never talked to a boy.
Asian families, kids are not allowed to date 22, 23. Yes. They never have that experience. And so then they don't know how to go about forming connections with people, because you really pick up those skills as a teen, don't you?
Exactly. You have, the only way we learn about relationships is through trial and error. But if we don't have the opportunity for trial and error, we just wake up being 23 and suddenly I'm allowed to date. But who's going to date me and how do I start? Where do I even go to meet people? And if I meet people, what do I tell them? I don't know how to handle this. But then at 25, the family is going, why aren't you married? So I think this is crazy how in the Asian culture, people are given no opportunity to learn about relationships, but then the pressure becomes huge. At the age of 25, 26, there's this concept in Hong Kong, the leftover women.
And tell me about
you
that.
Didn't know?
No.
Oh my God.
What's this?
So it seems that according to Chinese tradition, you kind of have to be married or in a relationship and sort of on the way to being a mother and the wife by 26, 27. Otherwise, apparently nobody will want to date you.
Oh,
this is
right.
what girls are being told. This is what girls have been raised with, because I suppose, it's all about being the most fertile, and in traditional society, the whole purpose of a relationship is to, build a family. But that's not quite true these days, right? You can still have babies in your 40s. But apparently this whole tradition is still alive and kicking, and girls are still told, oh my God, you're 28 and you haven't got a boyfriend. So all my clients tell me that Chinese New Year dinners with the family is like the worst possible thing that they have to do throughout their life. And they've considered renting a boyfriend just so that they shut the people up.
People do that in China,
yes,
don't they? They rent a boyfriend. And gay people do it. Exactly. They rent a husband or a wife of the opposite gender.
Just so that they don't get embarrassed and they don't get under so much pressure. And then I have clients as young as 30 who have said, oh, I missed the boat. I'm never going to meet anybody. And they have a word, I don't know the word in Cantonese, but the translation in English is leftover women. So they are women from 34 up into whatever their 50s who are told that, nobody's ever going to want you. You better settle.
How interesting. And that's the old saying back from sort of the 1950s in Western culture where they say you were left on the shelf.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But I think in our society, 34 is still very young.
So young.
So when someone tells me, oh my God, yeah, but I'm 34 and I'm not in a relationship, what am I going to do? I'm like, well, honey, you haven't actually experienced anything. You haven't met enough people to be in a relationship. You should just enjoy life. At 34, I was like, whoa, still so much to learn. But they seriously are. There's so much pressure on them. So I'm thinking if girls, first of all, this is for the parents. This is my message for the parents, that if you want your children to have good relationships later, do not tell them that dating is bad. Educate them well how to be good at relationships, how to communicate, build trust with them, so that if they are having difficulties in a relationship, they feel comfortable enough to come and tell you so that you can help them with your experience as an adult. But if you just ban people from doing what is naturally our instinct in those times, you either, piss your parents off because you're going dating behind their back, or, you feel like a failure because you are not taking care of your exams and all that. So it kind of screws with your head either way. And I see this in adults. So the reason I want to do this is because hopefully if we start this sort of education with teenagers, they will grow into people who can have much more positive relationships as adults.
So you'd like to work with parents as well then? It would make sense that you work with parents too, wouldn't it? Because it's sort of a bit of a two-way street, because the teenagers are still living with their parents and under their kind of jurisdiction. So,
well, we learn how to be in relationships from our parents. Whether they teach us or not proactively, we look at our parents, and depending on how they connect with each other as a couple, we think that's how relationships would be, right? This is one of our primary modes of, auto education, just looking at what other people are doing. If you're lucky to have parents that have a positive relationship, that have good communication skills, and they are able to build an atmosphere of trust and love and compatibility and everything is great, you're actually a very, very lucky person. Because once, on the one hand, you will have positive ideas of what a relationship looks like and the power of example, you'll have positive role models. If, however, like most of us, to be honest, have grown up in a family where there's maybe verbal aggression, there's maybe inability to resolve conflicts, there's always that whole taking each other for granted, and sometimes resentment, sometimes stress from work, or blaming, criticizing, judging, all that stuff. You actually also learn as a child that that's how relationships works. And you bring all that baggage with you in a relationship. Lack of trust. Recently I started working with the lady whose parents have had a very complicated life, like open relationships and affairs. And she's been hugely affected. And her ideas of what a good relationship is are entirely based on that experience. And she's experiencing huge lack of trust in any relationship, a desire to control a partner. She says, oh yeah, with all my partners, I've desperately tried to control them, like really being this kind of crazy bitch. Her words, not mine, trying to really know where they are at all times. And all this comes from our childhood. The way that we experience our first relationships, our own and our parents, is the baggage that we bring in a relationship. So if I can work with young people to maybe clear some of this up, they will have much better chances of having positive relationships as adults.
And it stands to reason, listening to what you're saying, that then if parents are in a dysfunctional or unhappy marriage, they're better off splitting and living happy lives than staying together and creating dysfunction and poor role modeling for the young people. Does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense to me, but of course I wouldn't want to say this to my married clients because
get a divorce and give up.
It's not my...
Or they should at least, we can't, it's not our place to say that, but they should at least work on sorting stuff out then. Don't ignore it. That's probably better advice, isn't it?
Being aware. For me, I really believe that the foundation of any work that you do on yourself is awareness. So really understanding that, whatever you do will affect your children in one way or another, and that you have a responsibility as a parent to give them a good chance to grow up as, like well-adjusted adults. It's a responsibility you have. When you decide to have children, it's not just so that you have someone to take care of you when you're old and you can't work anymore, but it really is to raise a new human being in this world and to give them every chance. And if you continue to stay in a relationship in which you're constantly arguing, in which there's violence and all this stuff that I mentioned, it can be way more damaging for the child. I work with this when I do hypnotherapy with my clients, and I see how much of the trauma and the damage that we have, the mental issues, anxiety, depression, suicidal tendencies, anorexia, all that stuff is actually all related to the parents and to living in dysfunctional families and thinking that's normal.
And a lot of people, before they get to therapy, they don't really even make the connection between their childhood and what they've experienced with their families, do they? And how it affects them later on. So it really does help to work with somebody to work through all of this stuff, doesn't it?
For sure, which is why I think it is absolutely imperative that if we want to change this whole, behavior attitude, we really need to work with all the parties, like the girls, the boys, and the families, the parents. And it's interesting, this thing came to mind as you were talking. I did ask some of my friends who are mothers of boys, how do they educate their children when it comes to, respect and consent and sex? What do they talk to the kids about? Because I'm always fascinated. I know there's still a big taboo around discussing sex with your children. I only know a handful of people who have open conversations with their children. And the point is, a lot of these ladies have told me, all I talk to my child about is make sure that he uses protection. If he's going to have sex, all I care about is that he's protected. Like, wow, there's a lot more that your son needs to know beyond using protection. Yeah, that is like really the basics. But you as his mother are responsible to teach him how to respect girls. And he will never have an opportunity to see how your husband treats you in private. So that kind of modeling is not possible. So you really need to have a conversation with your child Otherwise, how is he going to know? You're dumping all that stuff on the school, but how is the school potentially, no matter how great the school sex education programs, they're not going to be coming from your mother. It's not going to be wisdom from your mom. So I think especially in this respect, parents have a huge responsibility, and I don't know how many of them really proactively deal with that. Since I'm not a parent, I'm not going to comment on that, but I'm just giving an example from the people I talk to.
Yeah, so it's interesting, isn't it? And I don't know whether parents sort of hope to leave it up to the schools to do it, or they'll learn from social media or online. So maybe they're thinking,
they'll figure it out.
Yeah. Maybe a lot of people think, well, I didn't have much sex education when I was a child, so my kid will be fine. I'm fine.
Yeah, and look at you.
Yeah. Why do you think it's important for girls to set boundaries and to be able to say no, even if they like a boy and want to impress them?
Oh, especially if they like a boy and they want to impress him. It's not even.
Yeah. So why should they?
Well, because I think, as I was talking in the beginning about a sense of high self-worth, is actually, as a woman, probably one of the most important weapons that we have. Because if we're easy prey, so to speak, the boy will lose respect for us. So it is actually also our responsibility as women to build that, to respect the requirement. So having high boundaries, sometimes they call us picky, like, oh, you're very picky, you have very high expectation. I said, no, I have very high standards. So as long as a girl knows that she is entitled to have standards and to stick with those standards, regardless of who that person is, and to understand that if a person is asking you to drop your standards, it's a clear indication that they are not a good partner for you. I think that would dramatically change the dynamic of relationships in our world for teenagers and adults alike.
It's very good advice. It really is.
If you drop your standards, ultimately you will be seen as giving something up. If you keep your standards high, that person will desperately want to be with you because, oh my God, this is a person that I can look up to. This is very important, I think, for all women to learn how to be much more in control and much more protective of who they really are and not give up on our values, whatever those values are. Of course, when you're 13, you don't really know about that stuff.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you. How then can we help teenagers work out what their values are and what their standards are and their boundaries are?
I work with my clients, even adults don't know this, right?
Yeah. How can you help anybody set their boundaries?
So when I try to help clients define what their values are, we talk about events in their life. What are the things you believe in? What are the things that define you? What are some things that when they don't happen in your life, you are unhappy, you feel uneasy, you feel like there's something not right? That's when you know that that particular situation exposes you to one of your values. And for example, a more traditional person would value marriage, would value this kind of a classic relationship roles, let's say, where the man is the pursuer and the woman kind of waits to be seduced. That person will feel uncomfortable in a situation where those roles would be reversed, where the man isn't the pursuer, when they, the women have to take initiative and kind of lead the relationship. That will make a person like that very uncomfortable. She may not be aware of how this plays out, but through conversations and telling me stories of when they're feeling really fulfilled and when they're feeling happy and what's happening when they're not, we can actually work out what is it that they believe in. And then we discuss scenarios of how do you communicate these to your partners? How do you determine if the person you're talking to shares that value or not? Like, let's say adventure can be a value or independence can be a value. Like my primary value is independence. So I'll give you a personal example because it's the easiest to do. So how do I know that a situation is not, that I'm maybe in, is not in accordance to my primary value of independence is if someone is trying to tell me what to do or is trying to tell me, I don't know, what to wear or something like that. I would totally feel uncomfortable and I will reject that person because it really impinges on this thing that is a primary definition for me. And I think it works as well for teenagers. Of course, they have a lot less life experiences, so they're still in a sort of a fluid space. But actually teaching kids how to recognize when something is important to them and to stick with it and to create a standard of this is where my bottom line is, right? So standards are minimum standards. let's say a boy might ask a girl like, oh, you look really great in pictures. I would really like to see what's under your top. Or stupid questions like, what's your bra size? I don't know. I'm just making this up, right? But it could be something like that, right? Yeah. And the girl could say, well, my bra size is this, but just before you ask, you're never going to get a picture to know. So if a girl puts her foot down straight away, usually I would say the guy goes, oh, okay, I wasn't going to ask, sorry, because you've been there. You've just put the foot down, the stake in the ground. This is it.
That's setting a boundary, isn't it? And it also makes them respect them more too, doesn't it?
Exactly. So this is how we teach respect. Every single woman has the responsibility to teach the man in her life respect by sticking to her rules. It's like, no, if I say I'm never going to send you a picture, I'm never going to send you a picture. And don't keep asking me because it's not going to work. If we do that, what happens every time we give in to pressure, we educate people that it's okay to keep pushing us. Like every single time a man or a boy asks us something and we say, no. And then in the end we go, oh, okay, then we teach them that it's okay to keep pushing, that no actually means yes.
Yeah, because they eventually got what they want. So they'll continue to try it further down the line. All women need to make the stand.
Exactly. And if some do and some don't, the ones that do are called picky, are called drama queen, they're called aggressive, they're called all this, which again makes us feel bad. Like literally the client that I was talking to earlier was having this conversation with a man she was dating. And he was like, oh yeah, I don't need this kind of drama in my life. While what she was doing was like, no, this is not working for me. This is not how I would want this relationship to continue. So this is it. And he was like, oh, you're like this and you're like that. But
he didn't like being told no.
Of course not. Because it's not what men like to hear. And because some women give up or give in. So every time a woman does this is like the same with faking orgasm. I know it's a weird conversation, but the more you do it, the more it makes the guy think that he's the most amazing lover you've ever had. Whereas like, not quite so much.
Yeah.
So the more you do it, the more of a disfavor, so to speak, you do to the whole
generation of women.
Exactly. So to me, I think it's about girls and women taking responsibility for how we want to be treated by not indulging men with this kind of behavior and just keeping our standards high and learning that if you want to be anywhere near me, you have to play by my rules because this is my life, my body, my decision. And if you don't like it, I don't need you in my life. But most of the time we think, oh, but he's so cute.
Or he's the best I'll ever get.
How can I find someone else?
Yeah.
Trust me, every time I thought I cannot find a better guy, the next one was like so much more amazing that...
That's so true. And every heartache gets easier as well. So as a teenager, heartbreak and heartache is devastating.
Terrible. Yeah.
And then as you get older, by the time you're in your 40s or 50s, you're like, oh, whatever.
Yeah. Another one. Bye. Yeah.
So I think it's really a lot of it then, having said that, it's got to be about helping young people or teenagers deal with emotions as well, isn't it? And managing those emotions and keeping them in check or under control, which isn't easy. But emotions and hormones and all of that are heightened as teenagers, aren't they?
Yes, absolutely. But even adults don't know how to deal with emotions. I do a lot of work in this area with my clients, and what I think is really interesting, or I was surprised to learn as I was doing research in this area, is that emotions are actually just signals. We tend to blame emotions. We tend to say, oh, but I don't want to be so emotional because that's like a bad thing. But actually, emotions have a very important evolutionary purpose. They are signals that something is not right, let's say. Anger in particular, it's about telling you that your expectations are misaligned with the reality. Jealousy, it's about you thinking that someone else is getting something that you deserve. This is all about our perception of the world, right? So actually, sometimes I do workshops on managing emotions sometimes with adults, but I think it would be fun to do it with kids, where just by exploring what an emotion means and how when you're suppressing it, it's actually much more damaging than if you live with it and let it through you and acknowledge that it's there. It's like, this thing has made me angry. Why has it made me angry? Because it's this and this and this. And then I can maybe simply readjust my expectations or understand that the anger is there, but it will go away in 5 minutes. Just let it be.
Yeah. And I think it's about managing the emotions, not getting rid of them or ignoring them or thinking that emotions are bad. It's about not obsessing. It's about keeping them at a level that means that you're able to function in other areas of your life, isn't it?
Recognizing what they're about. They are literally our body telling us something. right? And if we know how to listen to what that signal is and we interpret it, then we don't have to stress over it. We don't have to, oh, I don't want to be angry because it's bad to be angry, so I'm going to suppress this anger, and sooner or later I'm just going to explode. I'm going to shoot someone. I'm talking in extreme cases, but it happens, high school shootings are because of that, because kids don't know how to manage all these emotions. And of course, hormones are definitely changing the whole brain chemistry of a child, and they don't know how to interpret it. They don't know what love feels like. They don't know what, sexual attraction feels like. And it's all so confusing. And there's also, I think what I meant to say earlier was that if a child or a teenager was looking for, let's say, sex positive or like truly informative and educational resources to learn about this, I don't know if there's that many that are very easy for kids to find. I mean, I know there's a lot of people who do work in this area, and I know schools put huge amounts of effort. But if that was true, I think kids wouldn't go to porn to learn, what their sexual identity is. So maybe there's still a gap in our world where people can come together, adults can come together and recognize that we need to educate our kids about sex and sexuality and relationships in a different way. I know they're probably fed up with us trying to tell them what to do, but...
Oh, no, I think they enjoy sex education. I think that's one of their more favourite subjects.
More favourite subjects, okay.
Definitely.
When it's done right.
Yeah. We've talked about girls and how they can set boundaries. Can you talk to me a bit about how would you deal with young boys and get them to respect women and make the right choices? You talked about mothers having conversations with their sons or parents having conversations with their sons and modelling. But from an educational point of view, what approach can we take with boys so that they're not pushing girls for nudes and that they're not having sex without consent? They're not taking advantage of people when they're drunk and things like that.
I think, we need to recognize that a teenage boy's sexuality is pretty much the only thing in their mind.
Yeah, don't they think of sex like once every 15 seconds or something?
I think the whole time, right? So in this respect, I have a friend who is a guy and he's a child psychologist and is actually also a professional parent. I don't know if you ever heard of this idea of professional parenting.
No, what's that? Tell me quickly.
So essentially, he was hired by a rich Chinese family to be surrogate daddy to their two teenage children, because the father and the mother are too busy. So they hired this guy who's literally a professional psychologist to spend 3-4 hours every day with their children and educate them about, being boys. And my friend texted me last week to say, hey, my 15-year-old surrogate child asked me, so, what's an orgasm and what does it feel like? It's like, how do you describe that to someone? So I think they're hugely curious about all of this. They really want to know everything. They're pushing boundaries. They're always going to try because this is how they learn. This is how we learn, right? I think just doing it in, having people that you can talk to, like my friend, the professional dad, who can explain everything, who can model behaviors, because he's a 39-year-old guy who also has relationships and all that. So it's kind of easier. I think the great thing about being a surrogate dad is you can actually model how to be a successful guy for a boy. Again, if they don't have anywhere to learn these skills, they're going to be all confused and they're going to go to porn and think, oh, I have to be strong and I have to be like this and I have to be aggressive and whatever. I think through a lot of situational discussions, what would you do if, and what would you do in that situation, and get them to talk to each other.
That's a great idea. I used to love that as a kid, with talking to my parents about made up scenarios. Groups. What do I do in this situation and that situation?
Because I think kids have very vivid imagination, and they do fantasize a lot, whether we like it or not, and that's good if they do, because that means they will have much better sex lives when they're adults. So if we can channel all that energy that they put into this, into learning and into positive perceptions of the whole world of sex, as opposed to all this warped stuff that they see on porn, and actually talking to real adults, who have been through this experience, and having adults that are not threatening to them or are not necessarily in positions of authority. I think being a teacher or being a parent puts you in an uncomfortable position to have a conversation with a teenage boy, because they're not really going to want to talk to you. So that's why having people who are outside of their life, but who are open about this, and they can come and, hey, for example, what does it feel to have an orgasm? It's hard to describe. but at least you can have a conversation and you can talk about all the misconceptions that they might have. Because I'm sure there's like a huge lot of, wow, what does this look like and what happens and all that. So to me, the idea was that, maybe we can put together support groups or joint workshops to sit down with boys, together with professional specialists in dealing with this, and like literally open the conversation, make it safe, create a safe space for kids to talk about this stuff. In fact, my friend and I were talking about starting a podcast called Kids Do Porn. Really? Where we would have teenagers come on the show and ask us questions. And
that would be great.
We would then either ourselves would answer those questions, or we get other professionals, I don't know, sexologists or psychiatrists or whatever it is that they need to learn. Because I think the reason why we were thinking about this, if they ask the questions and some of them might have answers and some of them, sometimes we might invite them to give their answers and then kind of play the real answer, just so that we see how much
where their heads are
at.
Yeah.
I think that would be quite interesting. I mean, we haven't started on that, but I think it would be an interesting forum for kids to learn about this stuff.
I think that sounds like so much fun.
I know, seriously, I want to start that. Yeah. I don't have the time to do it, but I would love to do that.
What's your advice to parents and teachers when talking about porn with kids? Because there's not really any way of managing it these days. With smartphones, kids can access porn any old time. Because it can be quite dangerous, kind of, in that it can give them a warped sense of sex. It can get all the foreplay and the relationship side of it and the love and the commitment and the passion and all of that. And then it can also, I believe, have some effect on their brain if they watch a lot of it, where they can't actually get sexually stimulated in real life because of porn. So what advice do you have there?
Well, I think, again, open communication. One thing that people forget about porn, and especially as a teenager, you have no idea that's what happened. Porn is actually a performance-based show. Right?
Yeah.
It's not.
And it's just sex.
It's not a reality of how it works. However, if that's all kids see, they think, oh, this is how it works, right? So, like all the girls are constantly, instantly aroused. All the girls like it rough. All the girls like all these like crazy things that I see. So they actually believe that that's how they should be as lovers. And when they eventually become sexually active, sometimes they really say, oh my God, that girl, she enjoys sex like a porn star. And when I hear that, I'm like, wow, seriously? Is that what you think that's good? Because, girls are also educated. They watch the same things. It's not just, it creates very unrealistic expectations on both sides. So I think the only way we can fight this is really by having honest conversations with kids. I don't know if as a parent, you can have a conversation about what kind of porn you're watching. It might be a little bit tricky. But I think that the problem is that I would imagine that if a parent catches a child watching porn, they would not be able to handle it positively. They will always be, I may be wrong and I would love to be proved wrong. But I think naturally as a parent,
you might freak out.
Yeah. You go, oh my God, what are you watching?
Yeah.
I'm going to ground you. I'm going to take your phone away.
There'll be a percentage of parents that don't, of course,
Probably.
And that are ready for it.
I suppose if I had children, there's the whole idea of ethical porn that is not, where
violent
where actors are paid, where everything is done
above
very
board,
tastefully. And it's not about the performance. It's not about everybody has to have an orgasm and like 7 orgasms or whatever stuff you see in porn. It's all about showing more of the connection, about what intimacy is like rather than sex. So I think having conversation with kids about the difference between watching a show on TV and real life, it doesn't matter if it's a sexual nature. So real life isn't like in the movies. Therefore, why should real sex be like on TV? But when you're 14 or 12 or whatever, you don't know the difference. You think, oh, this is how people have sex. This is what it's all about. And then you kind of learn that, yeah, sure, every girl likes spanking. Some girls do, but not every girl, right? So I think talking to the children about this is really important.
Yeah, so you've got to talk to them about having communication and conversations. And it's important for teenagers to have conversations about who's going to supply the condom. Are they ready to have sex? What's their relationship look like? Are they
what
committed?
Does it mean?
What does it mean? Are they ready? Are they both on the same page? And if you're not having that conversation, then you're not ready.
Can I just tell you, even adults don't have these conversations.
I know, but that's the thing, because sex is such a taboo to talk about in so many cultures, and it's a shame. So I think it's really great we're having this conversation, and I hope that anybody out there listening, it sort of encourages them to step out of their comfort zone and have a conversation about sex and relationships and what they like and what they don't like, and talk to their children and all that sort of thing, because I think we need more of that in society. And if that happened more, maybe there'd be less porn watching. No, that's never going to happen.
Well, no, but at least it's not so much the watching that is the problem, is what you make with it. What do you do in your head? If you're just watching it because you want some short, quick stimulation, that's okay, as long as it doesn't generate too much dopamine in the head and then you get addicted to porn, which is,
another problem.
Porn addiction is a real thing.
Yeah.
But if a child is able to understand, because they're having this conversation with the parent, to say, look, that isn't real life. That isn't how your mommy and daddy are having sex. There's a very different thing. It's all about intimacy. It's all about being connected. Ultimately sex is what we grow into, which kind of started life as the need to be touched by our mothers. That is one of the 3 fundamental needs that we have. So there's nothing wrong with it, but we make sex so wrong. And that's what causes all this mystery and inability to talk about it. But if it was just normal, it's just like eating, right? You need to eat, you eat. You need to have sex, you have sex. Why do we make such a big deal out of having sex?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I don't know why. I think it's because it's got something to do with our rude bits.
But we call them rude bits. That's a judgment we make.
I know, but that's another conversation, isn't it? Because we really should use all the correct names for everything as well.
No, apparently in Cantonese, they don't have nice names for this.
Don't they? They don't have words like penis and vagina.
They do. They either have very medical, like, these kind of sort of technical terms.
Oh, but not friendly names for
them.
And
then they have silly names.
Oh, okay.
Like,
frou-frou or something.
Like, apparently the female part of the anatomy is called an abalone. It's like, oh, I can't think of anything worse.
That's brilliant. I didn't know that. That's fantastic. So you'd like to work with teenagers, you'd like to work in education programs in schools. So if people want to get in touch with you, how can they do that?
Well, the best way to contact me is to visit my website, which is www.happyeverafter.asia. There's a contact form there. They can talk to me, or they can follow me on Instagram. My Instagram is a bit funny. My Instagram ID is fairy_godmother00, because I think it is my life purpose to make people find love, just like the fairy godmother. So yeah, I think what I'm interested in doing is trying to put together a partnership with as many professionals who are interested in this field to maybe create a support group for kids, teenagers, to be able to talk to us as anonymous resources about exactly the topics that we discussed, this making it possible for them, if they are, for example, being pressured by a next boyfriend and they don't know what to do or who can they go to, if they don't feel comfortable to talk to their parents or their teachers, maybe we can create a forum for them to come and anonymously get advice. I think that would be really helpful, because I remember how important your reputation is when you're in high school, and you don't want to lose that, and you want to know how to deal with that. I think for how to work with kids, I would love to have the opportunity to speak to groups of children. And if that turns out to be the best idea, maybe to have like regular 2-hour talks with them again, because it's one thing to give them a presentation and to ask them for their opinions and all that. But then if things happen, as they move through relationship, as maybe they apply some of the things that we discussed or the new strategies that I can provide them, how to say no, how to believe in themselves more, it would be interesting to see how they progress. And then, what is the trial and error rate, and what are their experiences, and do they see a change, or do they all feel like this is bullshit advice and they're never going to do it again?
And also it gives you a chance to form a connection with the kids, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think it's important for them to feel like someone is in their corner, someone that they can sort of call up and say, hey, look, I have this problem and I don't know what to do. Even the podcast that I mentioned, a space where kids can actually call anonymously or not and say, hey, I'd like to know about this. I know there's Google, but I don't know, maybe I feel that it would be more interesting to hear it from real people, and kids would prefer that.
I think so too, definitely. You also would be open to working with parents, wouldn't you, and doing parent forums about how to talk to their children, what to expect, I'm not teenage relationships.
I'm not a parenting expert, so I'm not trying to position myself in that position, but I think I am definitely a relationship expert, so I'm quite happy to put that out there. So I've already contacted quite a few parenting groups and organizations, and got a few dates in the diary to go and talk to them about, creating this atmosphere of trust, not freaking out. I want to call it how not to freak out when your child becomes sexual or something like that.
Yeah.
Because I think this is so important. Like, this is one of the biggest area of trauma.
For parents?
For kids.
Oh, and parents.
And parents, I suppose. But, the way your parents react to your first sexual experience is a huge determining factor in how much you're going to enjoy sex for the rest of your life.
That's so interesting.
Because I've seen it with a lot of my hypnotherapy clients, like, oh, okay, this situation is when I first had I had sex for the first time and my mother found out and she did this and this and this and this. And, I felt it took me years to get over the shame and the guilt and all the things that I've done. And of course, for women in particular, shame and guilt are two of the emotions that affect our sexual performance and our sexual enjoyment the most. So that's why you have women in their 40s who've never had an orgasm and don't actually enjoy sex because they think, oh, it's shameful, it's sinful, it's horrible. My mother told me that it's bad. So I think it's really, really important. If you want to have happy children, don't screw things up for them when it comes to sex, because they will have much better lives. Because then you're going to be on their case to have children very soon. And you are responsible for them not getting there. Of course, I'm being,
generalizing.
I'm generalizing here. But I think it is really important that parents understand how to talk about sex. Because I don't think, again, when they teach you how to be a parent, I don't know where they teach you. There's not really many places that tell you how to open this conversation. And often kids start the conversation about the birds and the bees without you being prepared and then having Googled it beforehand. And then you're like, I think before I never considered what would I say if I had a child and my child came to me and said, Mommy, what's an orgasm? I have no idea what I would have said. But now that I'm thinking about it, I can create different strategies, and working with my other colleagues who are maybe more aligned with how parents and kids talk to each other, we can come up with very specific scripts, if you like, or scenarios. I think it would be really useful for parents to sort of have a go-to manual. Oh, how do I talk about this?
Yeah, I think that would be great. I think they'd really appreciate that. And I think there's definitely parents out there who need advice when these topics come up, because often it's the first time they've dealt with it. And in this day and age, it comes sooner than they expect. I think that's the other thing. It often comes up faster than they expect. And it's like,
and you go, what? My 9-year-old has just received a sext. What do I do now? Because, I suppose you do have access to a child's phone, and you see all sorts of things that you would never imagine you would see so young. And then how do you not freak out? And how do you keep your own beliefs under control? And even for adults, sex can be scary. And it's like, oh, I don't know what to say. How do I explain this? I have no idea what that is myself.
Yeah, so anybody out there in Hong Kong, and people could Skype with you as well, couldn't they? Yeah. Anywhere in the world. If you'd like to have dating and relationship advice from Valentina, then you can get in touch with her, and information will be in the blurb of this podcast as well. So Valentina, thank you so much for meeting with me today. Fascinating conversation, so interesting and helpful and wonderful.
Thank you so much. It's been so much fun.
It's awesome. Okay, thanks.
Bye,
everyone.
Bye.
Confidants, before we finish, I'd like you to listen to this promo from my new friend, Javier Leiva. His podcast, Pretend Radio, is amazing. I absolutely love it. Listen to this promo and then check out the show as soon as you can. It's awesome. Hi, Confidants. I want to tell you about my Patreon page. I've joined Patreon in the hope of getting sponsorship for my Hong Kong Confidential podcast. Patreon is a great way for my listeners to get on board and sponsor me with monthly payments, and that goes towards my production costs and rewards for my members. If you're interested in checking out my Patreon page, please go to patreon.com and search up Jules Hannaford or Hong Kong Confidential. I would really appreciate you visiting my page. So that brings us to the end of another Hong Kong Confidential podcast. I'm Jules Hannaford. Thanks for joining me, and I hope you'll be with me again next week. If you enjoyed today's podcast, please can you go to iTunes to rate and review it. I would really appreciate your feedback. You can email me at jules@hongkongconfidential.net, and you can find me on Facebook and Instagram at Hong Kong Confidential. If you'd like to hit me up on Twitter, it's at Jules Hannaford. I would love to hear from you.
Love this podcast? Support it and sponsor today. Simply head to AuscastNetwork.com for details.